Hey, it's the hygiene episode. No, it's not about how to take a shower the right way at the YMCA. It's about your hygienist. So, in today's episode, we're going to be covering pretty much everything I've learned over the last 12 years in terms of KPIs that are hygiene related. And I'm going to talk about today the math behind some of these KPIs, because whenever I first learned about the KPIs, I didn't really understand them. They were just basically rules I would set or parameters I'd put around things that were coming out of dental practices. But now that I really understand the math of it, it's a little bit more simple for me to be able to explain it to you guys. I'm also going to include the ones that I learned a long time ago that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And I think that they've been, I don't know if debunked is the right word, but there's definitely nuance to the rules that I'm going to be trying to talk about a little bit today. So buckle up. Before we get started though, I want to talk about the elephant in the room that we have to keep in mind. And that is that dental hygienists are incredibly hard to find in some markets. It doesn't feel like, in terms of feedback from my clients, that it's as hard as it was maybe 2 to 3 years ago, but I still hear a lot of my clients having really big problems getting a hygienist in. Some are even opting to have like an associate do profis due to the shortage of dental hygienists. Take that into context for this episode's information, and also don't take today's information as like, oh, he said this, so I have to change everything and burn the ship down for my practice. That's not what this is about. This is about just understanding general rules of thumbs and understanding the pieces of the puzzle. So let's start with understanding what hygiene capacity is and what it means in your dental practice. So let's use some simple math. Let's define some variables. So let's make an assumption of 1 hour equals 1 prophy. There's 8 hours in a day, and there's 2 recalls in a year. So if you were to categorize each 1 hour slot as like an inventory item, then you'd have 8 appointment slots in a day, because 8 hours, 8 appointment slots. If you assume just 1 hygiene day a week to keep it simple, and there's 50 weeks in a year, that means you have 50 times 8 appointment slots, which equals 400 appointment slots per hygiene day per year. If you assume that each patient comes in twice a year with a 6-month recall, that means each patient uses 2 of those appointment slots per year. So if you have 400 appointment slots available, that means you have 200 slots for patients. So 400 appointment slots, 2 per patient, equals 200 slots for patients. So what that defines down to is that means that for each hygiene day, you have the capacity for 200 patients. So as an example of that, if you have 3 hygiene days a week, or a hygienist there 3 times a week, that means you have capacity for 600 hygiene patients. Now, you can tweak these numbers around a bit based off of how you want to run your hygiene department. But like, let's say that you had 30 minutes per appointment slot. And then all of a sudden, instead of being 8 appointment slots per day, you now have 16 available per day, because 8 times 2 is 16. That means your capacity jumps to 400 patients per hygiene day, because 16 times 50 equals 800 divided by 2 equals 400. So obviously this works with changing any of those variables. So number of hygiene days, amount of time per appointment, and the number of weeks worked, etc. The general rule of thumb, though, has always been that there's 200 patients per hygiene day in the hygiene protocol. And that's if only doing profis. So if you're doing like scaling and route planning, then that changes the rule of thumb quite a bit. So you can still figure it out though. So if your average scaling and route planning appointment is, let's say, 90 minutes, and half of your patients receive those, then you use a slightly more complex formula to calculate that capacity, but it's nothing too crazy. You use the same rule of thumbs that we just used before. Simply estimate the average number of profis that you're doing per day, and then use the same formula as before for the prophy side of things. And then you'd have a separate formula with this using the same variables for the SRP side of things, just using average assumptions and things like that. It's not going to be like super hyper precise, but that's never the goal with understanding KPIs. The goal is always to have an estimation, be able to approximate to head towards the right direction. Now that we have an understanding of what capacity for hygiene patients mean, how do we use that information? We can use that information to extrapolate a little bit about the general information about the practice at large relative to those numbers. Let's say we have a practice that has around 800 hygiene patients. That comes down to effectively that practice should have 4 days of hygiene per week. So if that practice has more or less than that, then you've found it either an efficiency or inefficiency in that practice. But what else can we do? Other things that we can do is we can look at things like the number of patients in the total practice. So hygiene consultants have told me in the past that a typical practice will have somewhere between 65 and 90% of their patients in their hygiene protocol. So that means that practice with 800 patients will usually have between 900 and 1,230 active patients. The way you get that is 800 divided by 90%, and then 800 divided by 65% gives you the estimation of the active patients in that practice. Why is this context important? A really well-ran hygiene department having, let's say, 80 to 90% of their patients in the hygiene protocol, with others having lower to 60s, that means that practices are different. And you shouldn't go and have a knee-jerk reaction to your numbers falling outside of those parameters. Those numbers are really important when it comes to context. And this is an area where the old rules of thumb have to have some type of clarity put together inside of them, and they have to have some understanding of why the rules were there in the first place. Because if you went out there and just said, hey, we only have 65% of our patients in the hygiene program, we need to up that to 90%, you could actually be messing your practice up a little bit because of how you want your practice to go. It comes down to your practice's demographics, it comes up to your setup, as well as your treatment philosophies. So if you're like a bread and butter dentist, you typically would have more hygiene patients because you're having them on protocol, you're bringing them in, you're just doing lots of typical dental work. Now, if you're focused on, say, emergencies, walk-ins, specialty procedures, cosmetics, implants, etc., then maybe you are closer to the 60% in your hygiene protocol because you're seeing so many patients that are referrals coming in from other dentists to do those types of things. It's kind of like that spectrum that you've got to be on. So you got to be careful for you to be honest with yourself of where you think you should be based off of the reality of what your practice is like. Like I said, if you're a bread and butter dentist and you're at 60% of patients in your hygiene protocol, so in other words, if you look at your active patient count, your active patient count's 1,500, but you've only got 4 days of hygiene, and that hygienist is doing hour-long profis, then that means you may have some opportunity to increase your hygiene department, which it will thereby increase the likelihood of you being able to get those patients in to be able to do that bread and butter dentistry over time. The flip side of that is if you're a specialty practice and you're like, oh, well, I want to have all my patients in hygiene, could that work to get them coming back again? Yes, it could, but generally it will inflate your overhead because of the fact that you'll have more people involved. And that's kind of up to you in determining how you have to do your treatment plan. Do I need this patient coming back over and over and over again? Or am I better to be able to serve a patient, do a really good job on them, and then have them go back to their typical dentist and things like that? Because you may be shooting yourself in the foot if you're trying to, I don't want to use the word pilfer, but if every patient that comes in the door, if you're trying to convert them into a recurring patient, whereas if they were a referral from someone else, then you may be shooting yourself in your foot and losing a lot of your referrals. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the capacity of a hygiene practice. We talked about how you should view how many days you have to be a measure of efficiency of how many patients you have in the hygiene protocol, as well as how that hygiene activity or hygiene capacity relates to your overall capacity as a dental practice with your active patient count. So let's move into the fun part, which is production. The old rule of thumb, and this is the one that I feel like is just really, really peculiar, is that the old rule of thumb is that your hygienist should be generating 3 times what they earn in salary in hygiene fees. In other words, hygiene money, like how much are they generating from their pro fees and things like that. It's wild to see how many different rules there are behind this and how many different people utilize this in different ways. Some people will go far as to say it has to be collections, which in some, the math isn't mathing. If you have a very heavy insurance driven practice and you're trying to get your hygienist who are likely hard to find, which means you have to pay more for them to be competitive in your area, to be able to get a collections rate that is equal to 3 times what you typically pay that hygienist. Let's say that hygienist makes $80,000 a year. That means that hygienist has to be collecting $240,000 a year in patient fees. And generally what is included in these numbers is the pro fee as well as the x-rays that the hygienist is helping with. You don't typically include exams in those numbers, and those typically go to the doctor side. If you come down to those things, if you're looking at $240,000 and you're looking at it over the patient count that we talked about, so 800 active patients, so 4 days a week from our rule that we used before is 800 patients. So for 800 patients to get to $240,000 in collections, you'd have to be at about $300 per patient in collections per year. So we all know that cancellations are a real thing. And that is a perfectly operating 4 days a week, 8 patients per day for 50 weeks in a row of nothing happening. And if you pay your hygienist more than $80,000 a year, then that same math keeps going the same way. There are hygiene protocols that they just do not generate $300 in collections per year due to insurance write-offs. And that's a tough metric to meet in a lot of situations. Because again, if you have a 10% cancellation average, then you're going to be at 90% of that 240,000, which assuming you can get the $300 per patient, that's going to drop you down to, $216,000, which is going to just completely throw the ratio off. So there's just a lot of things that are hard to do in that. Now, if you're a fee-for-service office, it may be a little bit more simple to do that. A lot of practices have tried to do assisted hygiene to be able to help with that. So like I said earlier, if you can change the math up a little bit to say, hey, we're going to use assisted hygiene to be able to lower the amount of time per patient, then that can also work as well. But then you've got additional overhead because you've got to bring an assistant in to be able to move things back and forth, which means you need to typically have a little bit more space, means you have more operatories, which means you need to have bigger capacity as a practice as a whole. It can get complicated of what you're trying to do there. Definitely in terms of like business efficiency and productivity is a way to be able to get your practice to be able to generate more revenue, have more patient activity, and be able to take care of things in a logical way. It's definitely a thing you can do. I will say that this is from my clients' mouths to my ears. I'm obviously not a practicing dentist, and I'm not someone who goes in and takes care of patients every day. But assisted hygiene can be a little bit tough from what I hear from my clients, and that the patients don't really like it as much because they don't feel like they get that connection to the hygienist. It's not as comfortable. They may feel a little bit more like, I don't know how to say this, but like a farm animal that's getting ushered from one spot to the next so that they can get in and get out. In some practices that you're operating under, that doesn't work. In some practices, that's not the practice that you built. And that's fine. You're allowed to not have that practice. But that is, unfortunately, one of the challenges of the hygiene department. You hear a lot of people say that they let hygiene be a lost leader nowadays because of the fact that they do generate other patients coming through. I'll tell you in terms of, from just a peek behind the scenes of everything, that the practices that don't have hygienists doing a whole lot of hygiene, the only ones that are profitable or super profitable are the ones where the dentist is doing a whole lot of dentistry, either big cases or a whole lot of yeses from patients for doing treatment plans. So you've got to do one or the other if you're trying to get away from that thing. And you're saying, hey, the hygienist is not there to produce 3x of their revenue. They're there to help support the dentist to be able to generate more production and more revenue from a dental side of things, which, to be honest with you, hygiene is a great piece of the business because it's the stickiness. It's the thing that keeps them coming back, because that's the way that you can generate repeat business and repeat care, and also how you keep up with people. But hygiene does not typically make you just a ton of money, and it does increase your headcount, which increases your cost. And it's not just the hygienist cost. If you've got extra assistants and you've got extra office people and you've got extra things going on like that, then you've got a lot of work going on, and the headcount is generally where the headaches come from. I should probably make that a saying. The headcount's where the headache comes from. So if you keep increasing your headcount, then it can get more and more challenging to take care of. Some people are awesome at the leadership role, and they really enjoy the management of people. They really enjoy the interconnectivity of having team members and accomplishing a shared goal. And if that's the case, awesome, go ahead and do that. But for a lot of people, that can be a challenge, and that is something that can be difficult. So in terms of the production number, I personally think that one's been a little bit debunked. Is it an okay one to keep in your head in terms of perspective? Yes, absolutely. But that spectrum that I was talking about earlier in terms of like number of hygiene patients for like bread and butter dentistries versus other types of practices, that spectrum is even wider whenever you start taking into account insurance-driven practices and fee-for-service offices and specialty services and things like that. If you have like just the most average dental practice possible, then yes, that hygienist may be able to generate 3 times their pay in collections, but man, it can be really, really difficult in anything that's outside of that quintessential, very like defined box of dental practices. Again, the way that you math that, if you're trying to do that for your practice, is look what you're paying your hygienist and give an estimate of an annual cost of that team member. A lot of the rules that I see and a lot of the people that I see touting things on social media say, oh, it should be the wages plus their payroll taxes plus their benefits and all those other things. And so if they're getting paid $80,000, you're actually paying them like $90,000 when everything comes into play. And so say you should take 90, you should take that times 3, that would be $270,000. And then you look at how many days that hygienist works for you in a week, if you want to use our standards that we used earlier. So let's say they're there 4 days a week. That means there should be 800 patients that they're taking care of. So you take the 2,700 and you divide it by 800 patients that they're servicing, because it's 200 patients per day, 4 days a week. And that will give you how much per patient per year should be generated in collections from that hygienist activities. And so in that example, 270,000 divided by 800 is $337.50 per patient per year from the hygiene protocol, which is prophies, fluoride, x-rays, etc. And also, obviously, I didn't even get into the scaling and route planning side of things, which is a whole nother ball of wax to get to. But I will tell you that I don't have any great rules of thumbs on scaling and route planning. All I can tell you is we don't look at this anymore because it's just so close to practice management that we don't touch it anymore, because as a CPA firm, while we have a great understanding of these numbers, we try not to dig into our clients because we don't want to give the presumption that we are practice management consultants, because we aren't, and we are CPA firms. We're not practice management consultants. But from a scaling route planning thing, what I can tell you from looking at all of our clients that we looked at in the past and from feedback from clients is that the spectrum on that is fairly binary comparatively to the other pieces of the puzzle. So we would look at practices, and this is like when I help buy practices and things like that. And it was generally like 0 to 1% of patients were on scaling or route planning, or 20 to 30% had it. It was like one or the other. It was very rarely in between those two things, because it was either the practice like did that as a thing or the practice didn't do that as a thing, was what ended up happening almost all the time. And so that's mostly going to be dictated by the hygienist that you have there, and then thereby dictated by the dentist that you have there in terms of their philosophies of the pieces of that puzzle and how they deal with their demographics and their patients and things like that. So scaling route planning, generally, yes, you can get a higher dollar per hour revenue metric going into there, which can help them get to that higher level. Since I can't even tell you, if you hit 30 people in front of me, I couldn't tell you which one of those deserve to have scaling route planning versus which one needed a prophy. So if I can't tell you that, then I can't really tell you which one is right or not. That's up to you as a dentist to be able to decide on your side of things. I will say that all the studies I would look at back, forever ago said that a very large percentage of Americans needed SRPs or perio maintenance, and the percentage of patients was way higher than 0 to 1%. It was something like 40 to 50% of patients had some type of perio maintenance that they could maybe use. So I can't be the one to tell you that one. So anyway, this production-based one, again, while that number is 3 times the pay that you're giving them on an annual basis, the whole conversation I've said so far is in terms of collections. I don't really think that's a great metric. I think that if you were to move that needle to say, instead of collections, it was gross production. In other words, the production that is created based off of what you would bill a patient for fee for service in your practice. And again, I understand there's some people out there who's like, well, I only do insurance. I don't have you should have a number that you would charge a fee for service patient in your head. Like, you should have a number that you should be charging them. And it should be whatever you would actually charge a person for that service. Even if you're a 100% PPO practice, you should have a number that you would charge a fee for service patient. And that is the number that I would say is the better metric to calculate in terms of what should be in there rather than collections. Because again, someone could hit, say, $300,000 in production in a dental practice and have a heavy write-off, and they only collect $160,000 on that patient. And that's a huge disparity. But if we take every practice in the US and we use that same decision-making process of, hey, it's the production, it's what we would charge for that thing, then that starts common sizing almost all of those practices very closely in terms of the efficiency of the hygienist. So I personally think it should be gross production. I don't have a dog in that fight, but when I try and tell people like, hey, how much are we generating from the hygiene department in terms of like the efficiency of the dollar spent on that hygienist, that is the beginning part of the conversation, is gross production times total payments times 3 equals gross production goal for that person. But, and this is where we go into the next section, that's not necessarily the most important thing. As I said just a few minutes ago, the most important thing in any dental practice in terms of driving profitability, it is never going to be your hygiene department's average amount of time per prophies. That is not going to be the thing that drives your profitability as a dentist, as a dental practice owner for that matter. The thing that drives profitability, and this is what DSOs all understand, is the production by the dentist, which means that comes down to treatment planning and acceptance. You've got to get a whole bunch of patients in there, and you got to treatment plan a whole bunch of them, and you got to get a whole bunch of them to say yes. And the more that say yes to the bigger things, the better. That is like the correlating factor to profitability in any dental practice. So how does the hygienist fall into that? They serve as an in to that service. They are someone who can help with getting to yes of that treatment plan acceptance. And that metric may not be something that you consider when you're looking at Like if you're just to be this robot that says, hey, I'm beep, beep, beep. If this number is less than this number, then fire this person and bring a new person in, then you could be missing out on some really great team players that can actually get patients in, make them feel comfortable, have them highlight some things and get potentially yeses for big treatment plans afterwards. Because when you walk in, they're like already prepared for that conversation and more willing to say yes because they've already heard what's been said before. So really, really, really good things to think about. As an example, there was a podcast I was listening to. It's called My First Million. It's a great business podcast. One of the hosts was talking about how his hygienist was saying, hey, do you have a good smile? Do you like your smile? And he was just like, yeah, I think so. And he was like, yeah, it's pretty good. And he's like, oh, interesting. Yeah, it's a pretty good smile. He said, you know who I think has a great smile? I said, I think that person has a great smile. And they had a picture of a person on the TV or something like that. And the podcast host was like, yeah, that is a great smile. And the hygienist was like, yeah, I know. That's your dentist today, and they're going to be coming in to help you. And so the dentist comes in, and that was literally their smile on the thing. I was like, wow, what a fantastic serve up to get someone to come in and be like, maybe I do need Invisalign because this person has a great smile, and they're the one that's going to help me. Anyway, examples of serving people up, getting people taken care of, and things like that. Not like the thing, but that's a really good example of that. That metric can actually be tracked. I think Dental Intel actually tracks that. Maybe Practice by Numbers does. I don't know. But that is a number that can be tracked with certain business intelligence softwares as well. And is one that's really important to take into context when you're considering the effectiveness of the spend on that hygienist. So to recap what we talked about today, we've talked about the KPIs that are important to understand about your business when it comes to your hygiene department. Specifically, we've talked about the capacity, how to measure it in your practice, how to judge how many days you need a hygienist for, how many patients should be in that protocol compared to your overall practice, how that aligns with your practice philosophy and the way that you want to treat your business. We've talked about the amount of production or collections that a hygienist could potentially be doing, as well as we've talked about the intangible side of things that you can't measure very quantitatively comparatively to the production and pay of that team member. So I also want to, just as a quick note, state that again, remember the hygiene department is an important piece of any dental practice, but the doctor side is typically where most of the profit comes from in any dental practice. And so we have to remember that that's a big component of what we're going through every day inside of dentistry. Did I miss any important KPIs when it comes to hygienists? I know I didn't talk about like fluoride or anything like that, but those pieces are the pieces that you add on after you figure out the other elements. I didn't talk about cancellations. I didn't talk about recall, like percentage of patients that come back or anything like that. There are numbers that are around for those things, but they're fairly specific to each practice. And I'll let a hygiene consultant talk about those things with you guys, since I'm obviously not in that game every day. I talked a little bit about assisted hygiene. That is a common thing that people do nowadays. And if you want to do that in your practice, more power to you. I think that it could obviously make a lot of sense and be a good thing to do as well. I'll also talk a little bit about how some practices are using associates to do hygiene nowadays. It seems like those hygiene checks are like 10 to 15 minutes compared to an hour for a hygienist. In terms of what that means, I'll let you guys decide on that since you guys are the dentist. So until next time, this has been Jonathan Van Horn with Tooth and Coin, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Tooth and Coin podcast. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star review as well as a written review. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps other dental professionals find our podcast and benefit from the financial insights that we share. So thanks for your support, and we'll catch you in the next episode where we'll continue to explore the business side of dentistry.